Hi, everybody. Welcome to this video for chapter 14. In this video, we are talking about ethics, compliance, fraud deterrence, and prevention. After this week, we will have only one more section to cover, which is litigation, advisory service, and remediation for chapters 15 and 16, and then we'll be all done. So we are making quick moves to finish up the semester. So let's jump into chapter 14. So you'll take a whole course on ethics, so I don't want to spend too much time talking about it. But basically, when does the fraud examiner or forensic accountant face an ethical dilemma? Basically, anytime that they have several choices to make where all of the outcomes have some sort of negative effects and the correct choice is not obvious, that is when an ethical dilemma will be faced. So how would we approach some of these ethical problem solving? So our very first thing to think about is it legal? So that's a very low threshold. We should never be doing anything that is illegal. So our starting point is to determine, is the action or conduct legal? And then we want to think about, does the means satisfy the ends? So this is kind of an outcome-based ethical framework, and thinking about, does some immoral or unethical or illegal activity make it okay to do something that has a positive end? So for example, lying. So lying is typically wrong, but if we are in an interrogation of an embezzler and are trying to get a confession, would it be okay to lie to that embezzler in order to get them to give us their confession? That would be one thing to consider in an ethical problem-solving manner. So then there are 3 ethical principles that are kind of a process for evaluating ethical decisions. So again, we have these 3 ethical provision or principles that are going to provide us with a framework for ethical decision making. So you should have covered these in your ethics classes, but here's a little bit of a recap. So first we have the imperative principle. So this provides very strict but easy to understand set of rules that we should live by. So for example, one of these rules might be that lying is always wrong. So this leaves no room for an exception. So lying is always wrong. You should always tell the truth under all those circumstances. So that's this idea of the imperative principle. We're setting these very strict, easy to understand rules. The problem with the imperative principle is that it assumes that everyone is aware of the rules and that they're willing to follow them, which may not necessarily be the case. So then that leads us into the utilitarian principle, which is it indicates that ethical problems should be solved by weighing the good and the bad. So we have to think about the good consequences and the bad consequences, and sometimes it's in the greater good to do something a little bit bad. So for example, we're talking about lying. So in some cases, it might be okay to lie because it's for the greater good. So in my house, it might be for the greater good for my husband to lie when I ask him the question, honey, do these pants make me look fat? For the sanctity of our marriage and the happiness of our household, it might be okay for him to lie and say, yeah, honey, you look great in those pants, when in fact, they may not be the most flattering. So that's this idea of the utilitarian principle. Then we get the generalization principle, which is kind of somewhere in the middle. So this says if all relevantly similar persons acting under relevantly similar circumstances were to act in a certain way and the consequences would be undesirable, then no one ought to act in that way without a reason. So this kind of reminds me of when I was a kid and I said, Dad, everybody's going to this party. Why can't I go? And he said, well, if all of your friends were to jump off a bridge, would you? So if everybody jumped off a bridge and died, then no one ought to jump off the bridge. So that's kind of this idea of that generalization principle. So some other things to think about when we're thinking about ethic at the individual or professional level. So ethics, trust, and responsibility. So it's impossible to provide a blueprint for every situation with our laws and rules and expectations. So we can't just outline every single thing. So because we can't outline that as a civilized society, we have to trust that we have these values and that everyone is going to kind of do the right thing. So when it comes to ethics and values as drivers of personal behavior, so individuals must make the commitment required to follow their ethical values in all cases, except those that have extreme consequences. So guidance and advice from professional organizations or other practicing professionals may help us as individuals to make those best decisions. Then when it comes to professional conduct, so as a profession, we're set apart because we have a specialized body of knowledge. We have a special admission standards. We're recognized by society as being set apart as a profession. We have standards of conduct. We have an organizational body developed to our organization. So we have professional conduct, and we also have guidelines provided by these standards that tell us ways that we should act. So we are given those standards and those conduct as a profession to kind of hold us above just the regular society. So as a CPA, we have that professional conduct that we should follow. Moving along to ethics, kind of at the organizational level. So previously, when we were talking about ethics in this video, it was all at the individual level. Now I want to talk about ethics at the organizational level. So ethics is the foundation for fraud prevention, both by individuals within an organization and for that organization itself. So how is an organization ethical? It all starts with that tone at the top. So ethics at the organizational level starts with our corporate governance, meaning the board of directors, the audit committee, corporate officers. They're the ones that will set this tone at the top. So what does tone at the top mean? You've probably heard it 1,000 times. It basically refers to a culture that's open, honest, and communicates the values of the organization to everyone inside and outside of that organization. So some ways that this can be accomplished is with a code of ethics that's signed by all personnel, posting the company's position on ethics in visible places, creating employee awareness programs. It's also important that individuals in leadership positions not only communicate the values of ethical actions, but they also have to practice what they preach. So organizations have to be committed to hiring honest executives and managers and staffs so that this tone at the top can trickle all the way down. Similarly, we also want to make sure we have proper supervision, because we know that trust is never a substitute for internal control. So even though we think we're hiring honest individuals, we want to make sure we're properly supervising them to make sure that everybody's doing what they need to do. So after we've kind of set this environment through the tone at the top of having dedicated anti-fraud measures, we need to make sure we're continuing or maintaining that anti-fraud environment. So this is going to require continuing education on fraud awareness to maintain a work environment that discourages fraud. We're also going to want our employees to feel valued, so that rationalizations such as my employee doesn't appreciate me aren't necessarily a concern for that employee. So thinking about that fraud triangle. So by making them feel valued, we're removing the rationalization area. Also thinking about the motivation side of that triangle. If we have an employee assistance program that could help make those non-shareable problems shareable. So if I have issues such as a drug or an alcohol problem, that employee assistance program could help me with that problem so that I don't have to commit fraud to overcome this non-shareable problem. So hitting on two of those three sides is that that employee assistance program. So we're making our employees feel valued and making helping to make that non-shareable problem shareable. Also thinking about disciplinary procedures. So it's important to prosecute fraudsters. So if we find out someone is doing something, we can't just sweep it under the rug. We want to make sure that we are prosecuting and obtaining or sticking to our guns when we have found something. We know that anonymous tips and hotlines and whistleblowers is where we will ultimately find the most fraud. So we want to make sure we have those mechanisms available. And we also want to make sure we're maintaining good internal controls. So we talked about the employee assistance program hitting on two of those three sides of the fraud triangle. But if they don't have that open door to walk through, they don't have that opportunity. That's where the internal controls come in. We want to close that opportunity. Your textbook gives you this 5-step approach of compliance, fraud prevention, deterrence, and detection. Basically, we start off by understanding our risks, thinking about what those risks are going to look like, meaning the symptoms or red flags that we're going to have, looking out for those red flags, developing controls and audit procedures to help us look for those red flags. And then when we find those red flags, looking at them. So basically, that's this 5-step approach that your textbook outlines. So compliance. So what is compliance? And in compliance of what? So compliance is going to help to ensure that an organization is following laws, regulations, its own processes, code of conduct, ethical standards, controls. So that is essentially what this idea of compliance is. So every organization should have some sort of compliance strategy in place to proactively identify risks, develop how they're going to mitigate those risks, and thinking about how they can thoughtfully and effectively and efficiently take action when they see these risks. So that is kind of this idea of their compliance strategy. So when we're thinking about these risks, what risks are we thinking about? So there could be economic risks, like the risk of market volatility or increasing interest rates, as we've seen recently. They could have environmental impact risks. They could have cyber threats, all different types of risks that we could have that we want to think about in this compliance strategy. So fraud deterrence. So throughout this class, we've talked about fraud deterrence, and we've indicated that there's two pieces on fraud deterrence. First, you have the fear of getting caught, and second, you have the fear of getting punished. So if you don't think you're going to get caught, that's not a very good way to deter you from doing things. So deterrence efforts also include detection controls. So how are we going to catch you? So in order to deter the fraud, we have to instill that fear that if you commit fraud, you're going to get caught. So how can we do that? So this perception of detection, we need to make sure that people think that if they commit fraud, they are going to get caught. And we have this little model here. So we have the fraud triangle over here, and then we have the act over here, the crime, the act, the concealment, the conversion, the actual crime that takes place here. So in between our fraud triangle, which is what's going on with inside that individual and actually committing that fraud, we know that just because, different people put in the same circumstances wouldn't necessarily commit that act. But in between these, we have these anti-fraud measures. So what stops someone from having the opportunity, the pressure, and the rationalization to actually go and commit the crime? And it's the idea that we have that fear of getting caught or the fear of being punished is what we have in between that fraud triangle and the fraud action triangle. So then when we get over to this fraud action triangle, we have some sort of detection measures that will help to identify when we see that actual crime happening. And then we can use that information from those detection measures to improve these anti-fraud measures, which would help us to detect those fraud and for that perception of detection to increase as well. So when we have an employee perceiving that they're going to get caught, they're less likely to commit that act. So we want to increase that perception of detection in order to prevent the fraud from occurring. It takes all the Huskies to pull the sled. So my high school mascot was the Husky. So this talks about like dog sledding. So we need everybody to do their part, to all the Huskies to pull the sled, everyone in the organization to help us prevent fraud. So your textbook goes through all of these different individuals, the board of directors, audit committee, and how they play into fraud prevention. So make sure you look at that section and see how each of these different organizations plays into that. And then your textbook gives this little 10 points of fraud risk management. So it's like part 1 is they have a commitment. Then we have the assessment, training, and communication efforts. And we have organizational leadership that affirms their commitment. We have conflict of interest disclosures, systematically completes the compliance and fraud risk assessment, zero tolerance, documented protocol for handling allegations, remediation, program evaluation, feedback loop for continuous monitoring and improvement. So that's that 10-point process. But essentially, obviously, this doesn't have 10 points, but this kind of summarizes what we have. So we start off by establishing that fraud risk management policy as part of the organizational governance. So setting that tone at the top, and we do that. And then we have our risk assessment. So we think about what risks there are, what those red flags might be like. And then we're going to look for those red flags through select, development, and deploy preventative and detective fraud control activities. So identifying what those red flags might be, then putting those control activities in place to help us find them. Then after we've found them, we want to report on them. So establishing a fraud reporting process and coordinating approach to investigate and corrective action, and then monitoring that fraud risk and making changes to this policy that we have. So we just see this kind of feedback loop there. So what happens after we've identified the fraud? So after we've identified the fraud, we want to make sure we're preserving the evidence as well as that computerized information, because we know that we don't want to sweep fraud under the rug. We want to make sure that it is prosecuted and that people see that it's prosecuted so that it prevents future fraud from happening. So we want to make sure we have that evidence and computerized information to help with that. We might also need to consult with trained specialists or our human resource department or legal counsel for advice on how further to handle the action after the discovery. It's important to react to early warning signs. So what are some of those early warning signs? We can have accounting anomalies, internal control concerns, analytical anomalies, lifestyle problems, behavior problems, a tip from a hotline. So these are all things that we would want to react to early. And then finally, we want to talk about some fraud prevention. So fraud prevention, you can basically just read internal controls. So how can we put some internal controls in place to help with fraud prevention? So the biggest one is always separation of duties. So in my audit class, I give the acronym of ARC for Authorization, Record Keeping, Custody. Here they've added initiation as a third one. So we want to make sure that we have the authorization, the record keeping, the custody of the asset, as well as the initiation of a transaction, all performed by different people, so that not one person doesn't have enough control to be able to carry out an act as well as conceal it in their accounting records. So that's always the big one. Some other ones that we have in place: accounting reconciliation, independent reviews, physical inspection, analysis, audits. Those are other things that we would like to see in place, or some controls that we would have for those fraud prevention means. So that concludes my discussion on chapter 14. Next week, we will move into chapter 15, which is our final piece of our final section, starts the final section on litigation. So I'll see you next week. Have an awesome afternoon.